Welcome to the highlights of Chapter 3. I'm Mr. Robin here to take you through supply and demand. Thank you for joining me. Let's take a look at what we're going to put together. Upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve. We're going to put them together in this chapter, looking at supply and demand and how this all works. So a competitive market, which is what we're talking about here for the most part, is the idea of many buyers and sellers. They're selling an identical product. Okay, corn is a great example here. Milk, wheat, items that can be sold by anybody, and you can mix and match. They all look the same. You really can't tell the difference in terms of who's selling it. And this is a competitive market we're looking at. So we have 5 key elements of this to demonstrate a competitive supply and demand model. This includes an upward sloping supply curve, a downward sloping demand curve. We're going to talk about all of these. We're going to talk about where they will shift and what will shift them. Remember what merits a shift in demand, and think trice for a shift in supply. We'll use those mnemonics in order to try and help us remember what shifts demand or supply. Those still apply in macro. We'll look for the market equilibrium, where they meet. That point of equilibrium where supply meets demand at a particular quantity and price point. And then we'll look at changes in that market equilibrium based on those shifts in supply and demand. That's what we're going to look at here. So demand schedule is essentially at a particular price point what quantity is demanded. Now remember, quantity demanded moves along the curve. It's important to note. Quantity demanded moves along the curve. Quantity demanded never shifts the entire curve. It's just a point on a curve. So for the price of cotton at $2, 7.1 billion pounds of cotton would be demanded, a quantity demanded, at that particular price point. But if the price dropped to $1, 10 billion pounds would be demanded. Okay, big difference. 3 billion pounds more would be demanded of this market at $1 versus $2. That creates our demand curve, and it is downward sloping because the idea here is as the price falls, the quantity demanded will increase. Let me say that again. As the price falls, the quantity demanded will increase, and we see this. As the price goes from $2 to $1, the quantity demanded is increasing in terms of the quantity demanded. Notice the curve has not shifted. Demand itself has not shifted. It's the quantity demanded that has shifted. So this demand schedule is essentially creating this demand curve that we see here. So when we talk about an increase in demand, in terms of what we see here, we're talking about the entire curve moving. Okay, so when we talk about an increase in demand versus an increase in quantity demanded, that's a big difference. Quantity demanded is 1 point on the line. Okay, the shift in demand, an increase in demand, is talking about an increase in the entire demand curve. So notice here that we have price points, but something has happened from 2007 to 2010 that the quantity demanded has increased. And so as a result, at $2, now 8.5 billion pounds of cotton are demanded, where in 2007 it was only 7.1. And that creates a second demand curve, or a shift in the demand curve that we see here in terms of the demand curve. All of those points, all those quantity demandeds make up the demand curve that we see here on this line. So an increase in demand, essentially, in this case, it's population that is shifting, and it's shifting the curve outward or rightward, versus a movement along the curve. A movement along the curve is just moving from one point at quantity demanded to another point of quantity demanded. That is a point along the curve. That's a movement along the curve that we talk about there. A change in quantity demanded is along the curve, D1. You never get to D2 in quantity demanded. A shift of the demand curve would be moving from D1 to D2, and that's what we would see here. So an increase in demand, the entire curve, all of those points on the curve shift outward or rightward, versus a decrease in demand, all of those points on the curve shift inward or leftward in terms of what we see there. So how do we know when a curve is shifting inward or outward? And that is the determinants of demand. These are the points at which based on the scenario, based on what you're reading, you would find there is a shift in demand. And market size, the number of consumers all of a sudden increases, your curve is going to shift outward for demand. The demand is going to be greater if your market is larger. The expectations change. If that expectation is growing, you're going to have a shift of the demand curve outward or rightward. If that expectation is falling in bad times, in recessions and bad economies, then the expectation may be shifting inward. Uber drivers right now, expectation for demand much smaller because people are staying home. So the expectation is shifting demand inward or leftward. Related prices of related goods. This isn't the price of the good itself, but the price of related goods like substitutes or complements, things that go along with it. Those prices change. That can change the demand for this good as well. If the price of ketchup goes up, the demand for mustard will probably move inward. If the price of ketchup goes down, the demand for mustard will increase or shift rightward because they're complements. They go together. So if the price of one good falls, the demand for that other good actually increases, and vice versa. Income, as incomes change. If we move to recessionary times, people fall on hard times, they lose their jobs. That leads us to inferior income. And as a result of that, we can see demand moving inward. If we are in a hot economy in which things are picking up and people have great jobs and they're moving from place to place and the economy is booming, we can see demand shifting outward as a result of that model. And then the last one, taste and preference. When we see a commercial or an ad or marketing is targeting us to try and get us to buy the product because we not just want to have it, but we find that we need it. We have to have it. That's a shift in taste and preference. And that can shift the demand curve outward or inward. Super Bowl commercials coming up are a great example of taste and preference. People see the commercial, all of a sudden they think of the product again, and they go out and buy that product. That's a shift in demand. That's a change in taste and preference. But remember this, if you remember nothing else about determinants of demand in terms of what shifts that curve, price is never going to shift the curve. The price of the good we are looking at is never going to shift the curve. It is not a demand shifter. It is not a supply shifter. The price of related goods can shift the demand curve as we see here, but the price of the good itself is never going to shift demand or supply. It's only going to move along the curve and change quantity demanded. Okay, so what causes a curve to shift? Again, as we talked about, what merits a shift in demand, the related goods here, substitutes and complements, which you can take a closer look at. It's a substitute for a good. If the price of a substitute drops, the demand for your good is going to move inward or leftward because people are going to buy the substitute. They're not going to buy your product. And likewise, the hot dog mustard ketchup example I used there on complements. If your price of hot dogs falls, then the demand for ketchup and mustard and hot dog buns is going to increase because they're complements. They go along with hot dogs in terms of that capacity. And then what is going to cause a curve to shift in terms of income? Again, if people are making more money, demand is going to shift outward or rightward. And if people are making less money, that's going to shift it inward. And we talked about taste and expectations there as well that address that. That leads to key graph 3, this idea of the demand curve shifting outward. It could also shift inward if it's moving inward or leftward. We don't use up and down because, again, the idea is they're slanted, they're moving downward sloping in a demand curve. So we want to move it outward or rightward, leftward, or inward. Now let's take a look at supply. Looking at the supply schedule, same type of model, but in this case, it's the quantity supplied that addresses the supply curve here, which is going to be upward sloping, kind of create the X of supply and demand. So this is going to show us how much is going to be supplied at these prices. Law of supply tells us that if the price goes up, the quantity supplied is going to go up. There is a direct relationship there. Now, if you remember back to the demand schedule, if the price went up, the quantity demanded actually fell. That is not the case here. That was an inverse relationship. This is a direct relationship. So as the price goes up, businesses want to make more money. They're going to produce more products. So if the price goes up, they're going to produce more. So the quantity supplied is actually going to go up too. And this leads us to a supply curve that is what we call upward sloping. Because as the price rises, the quantity supplied is also going to rise as well. Now, if we have an increase in supply, and we'll talk about what's going to shift the supply curve here in just a second, but if we have an increase in supply, notice that all of the quantity supplied is also going to change. That's going to create a new supply curve. Okay, so quantity supplied is one particular point on the curve, but the supply increasing is a supply curve that's shifting here, not just a quantity, not just a particular point along those lines. And so what we see here is an increase in supply. We have the supply curve itself, the entire curve shifting outward or rightward. And this can be new technology, and we'll talk about what shifts supply here in just a moment. But this is a shift of the entire curve. So quantity supplied would move along the curve in terms of what we see here. Quantity supplied is just going to be a point on S1. But moving from S1 to S2 is what we call a shift in supply. Okay, not a change in quantity supplied. Quantity supplied is going to move along the curve from point A to point B. That's quantity supplied changing. A change in supply or an increase in supply is going to shift the entire curve. Every point along that curve that was in S1 is now going to be shifted into S2. And so quantity can change here in quantity supplied from C to a potential D perhaps, but it's going to be movement along the curve versus a shift of the curve. So shifting the curve, again, increase in supply is going to shift the curve outward or rightward. A decrease in supply going to shift the curve leftward or inward. And that's what we see in this particular model in terms of key graph 4. The idea of the curve shifting outward or rightward in this model, it can also shift leftward or inward. Now, what's going to make that curve shift? Well, there are 5 determinants of supply. And I always tell students to think trice for supply. This includes technology. As technology changes, companies can do things faster, quicker, cheaper, more innovatively, more effectively, and they can produce more product at lower prices. So that's changes in technology that can shift the supply curve. We also have government interaction or government actions to related prices. Much like we saw in related prices that can shift demand of the related prices of those related goods. Related prices here include subsidies and taxes by the government. If the government increases taxes, supply curve is going to shift inward, leftward, because you're not going to produce as much. If you're going to cut taxes, that's going to shift supply outward. You're going to have more money because you're going to have less taxes. That's going to shift supply outward because business is going to have more money to do something with. If subsidies increase, same thing. Supply curve shifts outward. If subsidies are cut by the government, meaning giving you a subsidy or some type of a lump sum payment for milk production for dairy farmers, for instance, they have subsidies. If the government cuts those subsidies, that's going to shift the supply curve inward or leftward, and that's what we mean by related prices in terms of what we see here. If the related prices of something that's used in production of these resources changes, that can also shift the supply of goods here. Input prices, the cost of your resources goes up or down. That's going to shift the supply curve inward or outward. If the costs go up, supply curve moves inward. If the input prices go down of those resources, then the supply shifts outward. Same thing true of competition. If there are more sellers, you have more supply being created, supply shifts outward or rightward. If you have less competition, supply shifts inward. And the same thing is true of expectations. If there are changes in expectations that positively impact the supply of the market, you're going to see the curve shifting rightward or outward. If you see dismal expectations or lower expectations or negative expectations, that's going to shift the supply curve inward or leftward. But remember, price is not a shifter. Related prices and input prices can shift supply, but the price of the actual good never shifts supply or demand. It only moves along the curve. It only moves that quantity supplied or quantity demanded in terms of what we see there. Okay, so now we're going to put them both together. We're going to put together this idea of supply and demand at equilibrium, what we call a market clearing price. A market is created. This means every buyer found a seller and every seller found a buyer. There's no transaction that goes unsold or unbought in those cases. And that leads us to key graph 5. The idea here of perfectly competitive market, supply curve is upward sloping, demand curve downward sloping, the equilibrium, point E, labeled at P1, a price level at P1, a quantity at Q1. This is the key graph for a perfectly competitive market. Notice that there's no shortage, there's no surplus, there's no deadweight loss. everybody is allocatively and productively efficient. We are successful in producing, and our price and quantity is at equilibrium. So everybody's happy. Sellers, buyers, we have a market clearing price at equilibrium. This is a great place to be. We won't stay there long, but that is a great place to be. Now, what we're going to see in the coming key graphs as we close out this chapter are some sample key graphs on shifting this supply and demand. So in this model, and there are more to this, we go all the way to key graph 13 here from key 6, but I'm only going to show you 4 that are impacting those, and you can deduce from the key graphs that are in the MyMCPS modules section under key graphs. You can see all of them. But the idea here is we have a shift in demand. So that means what merits a shift in demand? Well, that's going to be market expectation, or the market size. That's going to be the idea here of expectations of the related price of related goods, such as complements or substitutes, of the idea of taste and preference and income that is really going to shift demand. So this is moving outward or rightward. Notice supply is moving along the curve. Supply did not shift. It's just demand in this case. But it takes us to a new equilibrium because supply moves along the curve at this new demand curve at E1, price level at P1, quantity at Q1. Notice we've also added a legend out to the side to show us what is happening to price. It's going up. What's happening to quantity? It's also increasing. So in this model, we have more demand, greater quantity, but also at a higher price in terms of what's going here. Now, if demand were shifting inward, we would see this. We would see price and quantity both falling. Same model, but the idea here is you would show price falling, quantity falling, and the equilibrium would be somewhere down in here in terms of what we would see there. And that is key graph 7, and if you want to go check that out. Looking at a shift in supply, key graph 8 actually takes supply outward. I chose key graph 9 here to take supply inward. But the idea here is we have a shift inward of the supply curve. In this case, think price for supply. So it could be technology has broken down, maybe a factory burnt down or something like that. So we have supply shifting inward. Notice that demand is moving along the curve. Demand doesn't shift in this model. It moves along the curve to the new supply curve at S1. And the price level is higher and the quantity is lower. So because of supply shifting inward, we have less of it. We're going to be charging more for it because we have less of it. And so we're seeing, again, in the legend out to the side, that the price isn't going up, but the quantity is falling. We have less of product to be able to share here. And then again, if the supply curve were shifting outward or rightward, we would see the price falling and the quantity increasing. That is where new technologies do help in moving the supply curve, and ultimately the PPF, moving that PPF outward or rightward, because what we see there is it's moving outward or rightward along the and demand moving along the curve to that new point at a lower price level and a greater quantity. Now what we're going to do in the last 2 key graphs is really shift both curves. So you have demand and supply both shifting. Now in this model, we have them both moving in the same direction. Anytime you have a supply and demand curve shifting, one of these, either price or quantity, is going to be what we call indeterminate. Okay, and I go to this graph to show the model. If supply is increasing and demand is increasing, notice it's price that's indeterminate. Quantity is increasing because you have supply and demand both moving in the same direction, which is what we saw in this particular model. So price is indeterminate. We don't know if it is going up or down, but what we can say is quantity is definitely increasing. That is what we're seeing in this model. So price, put a question mark there. That means it is indeterminate or ambiguous, but the quantity is definitely increasing. Now notice if we have supply decreasing and demand decreasing, again, price is indeterminate, but we know the quantity is falling in terms of what we see in this space. If we have one going up, one going down, that's the last model that we're going to leave you with, which is supply is moving inward, but demand is moving outward. Maybe supply broke down, or a factory closed, or a factory is offline. but the taste and preference has shifted such that people really want the product. Well, we know price is definitely going up, but what we don't know is if we have more quantity to be able to sell out there. So quantity is indeterminate, but the price is definitely increasing in this model. And I would encourage you to go back through the Chapter 3 video overview, which I go through all of these key graphs from key graph 3 all the way to key graph 13, and I give examples of each one of those. So the overview video on Chapter 3 will definitely help you if you have more questions related to those graphs in terms of what is shifting supply and demand in those spaces. Hope you found that helpful in terms of the highlights of Chapter 3. We will see you over at Chapter 18, 17 in the textbook, on international trade, and we look forward to talking with you there about autarky, quotas, and government taxes, and tariffs, and getting into some of the macroeconomic functions of supply and demand. And we'll see you over there.